etching ink. And it's a good idea to warm the ink up a little bit, make sure there's not anything dry or stuck in the ink. Could you turn the vent off so that we can hear? This ink looks pretty good. Usually the black ink is kind of ready to go. Black ink is the easiest. And then I'm going to use a cardboard chip. I don't want to ever scrape the ink across with a metal surface because that's a really easy way to get a bunch of new scratches in your plate. So I'm going to scrape it on using the metal surface. And I could, at this moment, this is not a bad idea, put on some gloves. All right? Or I could show you guys how to hand wipe it. I'm going to hand wipe it. All right, here we go. So I'm just going to sort of scrape it across and kind of just pushing ink into those little nooks and crannies. This is a plate that has line etch on it, but it also has aqua tint and soft ground. So there's like a range of different kinds of lines on this plate. But I kind of just want to scoosh the ink into all those lines everywhere. All right, great. And now I've got the ink kind of in those lines. I want to try and squish it out. Like I'm going to scrape off as much ink as I can now that I have the ink already in those lines. So these cardboard chips, sometimes they're sharp and sometimes they're not sharp. So sometimes it's helpful to like rotate the cardboard chip until you have like a nice crisp edge. And you can kind of see how that will do a better job of removing ink. So the more I can scrape the ink off, the faster the next step will go, right? So I'm just going to kind of scrape the plate down. Every printmaker you meet will kind of do this a little bit differently, but the idea is always the same. Here we go. I like to hold the plate while I do it, and I find that I tend to like always hold the plate in one hand and wipe it the other hand, right? So I end up with getting like one dirty hand and one clean hand. I'm gonna grab a tarlatan from this box back here. Okay, so this is our tarlatans. They're basically like starchy cheesecloth, okay? And they can be used even though they've gotten kind of dirty, a little soiled, it's still working. So I'm gonna go ahead and bundle the tarlatan into a firm little muffin, okay? And I like to start out my ink wiping process with pretty firm, steady pressure. So I like to start out with kind of a pat and twist, right? So I'm kind of firmly setting it down and giving it a little twist. I want to get the kind of bulk of the ink off to start out. And I'm also rotating and trying to wipe everywhere and not just in one particular spot. So I'm getting the ink everywhere and I'm going to wipe it everywhere because I really want even plate tone all across the plate. Okay? And you can see the image is starting to come out a little bit. Yeah. Now that I'm at this point in the process, I like to get to a cleaner part of the tarlatan. It doesn't have to be that clean. I like to joke that printmaking is the process of figuring out how clean you can get something by rubbing two dirty things against each other. So now I'm going to lighten up my pressure just a little bit, and I'm going to change from the pat and twist to a more sweeping gesture. So I'm kind of like, I'm petting the block. I'm still using kind of moderate firmness, not like a ton of firmness. I don't want to, if I use too much pressure as I get closer to finishing, I might over wipe those lines, right? And I really want to make sure that those lines are still holding ink. If you've over wiped the line, it'll kind of print as a dotted line. Or what we like to call a starved line. It's starving for ink. Okay, so that's looking pretty close. I'm going to do one last bit with an even cleaner part of the tarlatan. But this time I'm actually going to go for very light pressure. And I'm gonna do, you know what contact juggling is where you like juggle but doesn't ever like leave your body. I'm going to contact juggle the tarlatan. So I'm not going to pick it up and touch it down, because at this final stage, any wet ink that's on the tarlatan can leave little speckles on the surface. But if I don't pick up the tarlatan, there are no speckles. So very lightly, just kind of petting the plate. Okay. That looks, so then you look at the plate and you see if there's any spots that are kind of cloudy. So here I see a little bit of clouds, so I'm going to kind of hit that spot a little bit more. All right, that looks pretty good. Now, I also like to hand wipe my plates, so sometimes you might do that final step here with your hand. You can either use the pad of your hand or what I like to call the blade of your hand. If I'm using the pad, I'm kind of pushing this way, and if I use the blade, I'm using kind of this way. And if you have some spots that you need to address, and I have really dry hands, so the ink just sticks to my hands super well. If you have like warm hands, it might not be a super easy option, but I'm gonna just kind of like gently kind of pet the plate. And if you're doing this technique and you're trying to clean up that last bit of ink, wiping parallel to your thick lines kind of cleans up on either side of the line, or wiping from the light areas into the dark area. So you can see I'm kind of wiping in the direction of the lines that are already on the plate, and kind of just going for like a real feather touch here. Like I'm just sort of skimming across the surface of the plate. All right. This is where students sometimes get like a little crazy because they want their whites to be bright white, and then like kind of wipe to make the whites pop, and then they end up over wiping their lines. Could you grab me a paper? Oh, here, I'll just take this one. The next step is something that people always forget, but you are not going to forget, not today, is you want to make sure your bevels are clean. So take a rag and just go around the edges and wipe ink off of those bevels, okay? Every semester I have a couple students who are like, but I like the way the ink looks in the bevels. No, it looks bad. We're cultivating taste. Wipe the inks off your bevels. If you do any more tarlatan after this step, you will get ink in your bevels and you'll probably want to wipe them again. So if I do this and then I'm like, oh, I missed a spot, I've just wiped more ink into my bevels, so like hit it again. This is always the last step that you'll do. If your bevels aren't smooth for whatever reason, they might still hold ink after you wipe them. So you may have to polish them a little bit. All right, next up, we're going to print this. All right, my hands are clean. I'm ready for the next step. So I'm going to take it over here to this press bed. And what I want to do is I actually want to take my registration template and tuck it underneath this plastic sheet. The reason for that is that I can keep this plastic sheet clean. If I get ink, there's probably ink on the back of my plate, and if I get ink onto my registration template, I'm going to have a dirty registration template. It's hard to keep things clean. But I can do this, and I can keep this surface clean. So I'm lining it up right there. Everything looks good. Then I'm going to pull my paper out of the bath here. So hold it up on its corner. Let it drip. And then we'll blot it. So I'm just going to fold this over and blot it. There's a lot of students in this class, so if you come over here and the towel is wet, hang it up to dry, grab a clean, dry towel. You are allowed to have that. Ideally, you don't want your paper to have any sort of like puddly standing water on it, so you can kind of feel it. If it feels cool, but like, that's perfect. All right? And then next up, the way that I like to do this is I'll just line it up against one of the edges, right like that, and then drop it into place. And then I always want a backing sheet. So there could always be smudges or something, or things could shift. So I always like to run it through with a bit of newspaper behind it so that we don't ever get anything on the blankets. It's not perfect, but if you do get something on the blankets, we'll be sending you to the dry cleaners. All right, and we'll run this through and see how it prints. This press always feels a little bit tighter. They're printing at the same pressure. This one just is geared a little differently, and so you feel the plate a little bit more on this press. let's see how we did. Okay, so that looks pretty great, huh? Okay, if I let this dry on the drying rack as is, it'll dry wrinkly. So what I like to do is I like to dry it in our blotters papers over here. So let me show you the system really quick. We have these blotters, and you'll notice that there's a bookmark here that tells you where to start. So you can take your print, put it in the blotters. Ideally, we'd use like a piece of newsprint just on top of it. We've had some issues with ink transferring to the underside. This is like dry ink, so it's not really going to be a problem. And just cover them up like that. And we can then, as we move up the stack, we'll move the bookmark up to where we're at so we can know where things are. And then we'll just put these down and let it dry under weights. At the end of class, I will take the whole class set and move them down to additional fresh dry blotters down here. And so that's where they've been moved to. So don't panic if things are not where you left them. We've given them a second blot in the lower blotters. And that should be enough to get everything to dry flat. And that's it. Thank you.